Hello and welcome to the Windswept Tree Farm. We've put together a slideshow for you. We wanted to show you what we do year-round, which really is the bulk of the activity because the selling season obviously is very short between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we wanted to show you what we do the rest of the year. We've started off right after Christmas, and by that point we are usually exhausted and like to work in as many naps as we can. We also do get a lot of snow up here, and so we like to get outside and sled and make snowmen, just enjoy the winter scenes as much as we can. But again, I think the key thing we want to stress is we do like to nap. So that's one of the first things we can do and one thing we will look to do. But that doesn't last too long, and we have to get outside and get working. And you can see from the upper left, I've commandeered one of my elves to help me do some basal pruning. Basal pruning is just a fancy way of saying you're cutting the lower branches of the trees. And that is a very important task, even though a very tedious one, because evergreens, particularly true firs, are susceptible to disease, and a lot of those diseases stem from the bottoms of the trees. So if you have a lot of weed growth, which I tend to have at times, or you have a lot of lower branches, which I also tend to have, that ends up restricting airflow beneath the tree. And the net result is that it makes the tree more susceptible to disease. So it's important to get that taken care of, get the airflow underneath there as best as possible. And late February, early February, if there's no snow, is a good time to do that. We also cut the stumps as close to the ground as possible, because then that prevents tripping hazards and also allows our mower to go right over the top of it without catching on it, whacking on it, and making a general mess of the field. So it's important to get the stumps out, remove them from the field, make a kind of a level playing field, if you will, so the transition from previous season cutting to new planting can occur as seamlessly as possible. From that point there, we like to lay the field out. And we run a line out which has flagging about every 5.5 feet attached to it. I used to have my dad help me lay out the rows. He's no longer helping me with that, and I've noticed the rows are a lot straighter since I've just done a solo job. Not to blame him, but it is also easier to not blame yourself for things I've noticed. Each row is separated by about 6 feet, which you can see from the middle photo there. We think that spacing we have right now is pretty good, and we're going to try to hold to that, maybe adjust it as we go. You do need enough spacing to give the trees room to grow without crowding each other, and also you have to be able to get a mower through there because certain areas of the farm have a lot of thick grass to it, and you want to try to keep that down best as possible. Once the rows are laid out, I should say the rows are laid out, we just go through with marking paint, and wherever there is flagging, we just put a mark on the ground, because that will be the location where a new hole will be dug, and eventually a tree will be planted in that spot. We've worked on spacing over time. There's different methods folks use. We think this works pretty good, and we may try to space it out a little more in the future, but for now I think we're going to leave it at the 5.5 between trees and 6 feet between rows. Obviously, if we had more land, we could probably space it out a little more, but given the tight constraints that we have, this seems to be what works best for us right now. And the key thing is moving forward, because we have to get those new trees in the ground, and then to get them out of the ground we have to make a hole for them first. And we have used this power auger. This is the Little Beaver, and it's a very solid machine, good machine. It's a very heavy machine though, and if you're doing several hundred holes, it can be a lot of work. It probably weighs close to 400 pounds between the mower that's towed toward the rear, there's a torque bar, there's a cutting head, and then there's the actual auger itself. So it's a very heavy machine, but it does a very good job. We use the auger as opposed to the shovel or a planting bar, just because I think it makes a better hole, and it's key when you have a young tree go in the ground that it has room to move laterally, because that's the direction the roots tend to go. They don't go down like you would have in a deciduous tree because there's no taproot. They move laterally. So when you have the auger, it really loosens up and rips the soil apart and makes a wide, clean hole. But there is downside to that as well, because that means you have to bring in more material as backfill material when you use the auger. But I think that's a price that's well worth it. The downside, because of the weight, and you can see it's kind of lengthy when you attach it to the torque bar. If you have existing trees in the field, you have to move around those, so that makes obstacles. And it's also a little tricky on slopes. So if you have a flat space to work, it tends to be really an ideal machine for those kind of conditions. So overall, on our farm, this machine seems to work fairly well for what we're trying to do. Next, what we do is get the actual trees out of the ground. They're in we call transplant beds. We get the trees as 2-year-old seedlings and we plant them in the beds, and they're in the ground for 2 years. And at that point, they're ready to get dug out and planted in the field. We have to do things kind of in reverse, because we have to get our new seedlings from our suppliers, but in order to have a spot for them to go, we have to dig these trees out. So we start out, we just take a shovel and you dig out wide as you can. Dig out well below the roots, because they're still down 6 to 12 inches at that point, because the soil is very loose. And then you have to get out wide, because they tend to go wide. And if they're in the beds 2 years and sometimes longer, they can get really twisted up and tangled. So it's important at that juncture to go slow, not rip the roots. You don't want to damage the roots when you're digging them out. You want to keep them, they have kind of like their outer skin, if you will, and it's important to keep that intact, so when you put them back in the ground, they're healthy, they won't be susceptible to disease at that point, and they're ready to go. They all get dug up by hand. It would be ideal if you had a nice machine to do this, but for right now, everything is done by hand. They're dug out, hand separated, and at that point, they're really ready to transition to the field, and then that will be their permanent home until they are cut down and brought home to your house as a Christmas tree. We put them in the field, in the holes that were previously dug, and before they can actually go back into the ground, we do a couple different steps. The first step is we root prune, because the roots, when they're dug out, can be 12 to 18 inches long, and that's really too long for to put in the ground. Plus, that if you have a 12 to 18 inch length root, that means you have to have a 12 to 18 inch deep hole, and that's really a lot more work and a lot more material in terms of backfilling and packing in and so forth. So we root prune those down quite a bit, and root pruning also really invigorates the tree and promotes growth. It kind of wants to branch out once it gets those roots cut out of there. So it's important to do that as a good step moving forward. We also do something here, which is an extra step, which a lot of people don't do. We put our trees in a mycorrhiza root dip gel, and the root dip gel really acts as like an outer coating, as a protection for those trees. And I think that's really important when you have those typical hot July dry spells where you don't get any rain for maybe 2 to 3 weeks and it's 90 degrees and the sun's beating down. Because as I mentioned earlier, the tree roots grow laterally. So they branch way out past the tree, and they're in a very narrow band of 4 to 5 inches below the surface, and they can lose a lot of moisture when it's really hot and really dry in the summertime. So that root dip gel, I think, gives it that little bit of extra insurance to get it through those really dry times. And also the root dip gel, by putting it in there, gives a little more moisture. Ooh, that's Arthur, our kitty cat. We ask that if you're out in the field, he may be chasing you around, but more importantly, he likes to go inside your car or the back of your pickup truck. So take a look, make sure you're not transporting our cat along with your tree, because we do want him to stick around and be part of our family. And again, as you can see in the upper left hand picture there's some really dark material that we use to backfill around the trees. It's a 50-50 mix of topsoil and compost. And I think that works much better than just topsoil. It's got a lot more organic material. It's very rich, and the trees seem to respond really well to that material. And also, it's important when you're putting that material in that you pack it tightly around the tree, because you can have really a late frost, and if you get a very heavy late frost, you can get a heaving of the tree, and what that ends up doing is really just bumping the tree right out of the hole. And the net result of that could be you have the roots exposed to the air, and that's really bad because that dries them out really quickly, and that could either lead to death of the young tree or damage to it. And it's hard enough to get them healthy from the seedling to the field without things like without the damage from the frost heaves. From there, we tend to, just pack them in tightly, get them in the ground inside with the nice, healthy compost topsoil mix, and then we lay them out in the rows. And the picture's a little slanted, but that's kind of a straight row. And from there, we tend to mulch the trees too, because mulching's important. As I mentioned earlier, the roots from the evergreens go laterally. So the mulch on a wide enough band protects the trees for those first couple of years while they're really, getting their traction inside the holes. After about 2 to 3 years, it's rare where they have too many problems at that point. They're usually very, very healthy, and they're past the worries of drought. They're past the worries of some of the other little, nagging things that seem to happen to the smaller trees. I think I do more damage mowing around the trees, trying to get too close, than we get from any disease or we get from a lack of planting. Typically, if we were going to, say, plant 500 trees out in the field, if we lost more than 30 or so in the first 2 years, I would be very surprised. Generally, like I said, we do more damage to them when we do mowing as opposed to any of our planting techniques or just general, annual care that each tree receives. So the trees are laid out in the rows, and that's really, come springtime, that's the main activity, getting them out of the field. And after they're out of the beds, we have to get the beds ready to transition to bring in the new seedlings that we get from various suppliers from across the country. There's 2 types of seedlings that are available on the market. The upper left-hand picture, you can see I have a seedling in my hand. That's known as a plug seedling. A plug seedlings come in these little cylindrical packets and little containers. The advantage to the plug seedlings is they can be grown in the greenhouses, so that's, from the supplier side, that's nice. They're very quick to plant, which is one of the main advantages folks like who put them in beds like myself, because you can just plop them in the holes really quickly, as opposed to the upper right hand picture shows the bare root seedlings. Those come with very long roots. You end up having to root prune them, and they go a lot deeper than the plug seedlings. But I think the bare root seedlings transition to the field much better than the plug seedlings and tend to grow quicker. But there are advantages to both, and I can see why folks would want to use the plug seedlings. Typically, if you're doing probably a couple thousand seedlings a year, you probably would want to do as many plugs as you could, just because it would save you time. We're kind of a relatively small grower, so we can do either or. It's not that much of a difference in terms of the time management that's involved in getting them in the field. Regardless of whether we use the plugs or the bare root seedlings, we have our planting bar, which you can see pretty well in the upper right hand picture. It's just a notched board. I think the notches are every 4 or 5 inches apart, and basically you just lay those out as straight as you can for a new row, and then you either dig down by hand or you dig with a trowel and plop that tree right in there, and then backfill the soil right around it, and then you move on to the next one. You can do this fairly quickly. It's kind of a just an operation that moves from seedling to seedling. As long as you're ready to go, it should happen fairly quickly, much quicker than planting the larger trees out into the field. And this time of year, we're looking at May, June, July, August is when we start to do the real heavy labor on the farm. We have to mow the field 5 to 6 times a year, and after each time probably takes 16 to 20 hours to do, depending on how close you want to try to get around the trees. And that gets really old really fast by the time summer kicks around, especially if it's, we've had a lot of moisture and you're still mowing in July and it's 90 degrees. You really don't want to do this. It gets hot. It really just not a fun activity. There's a lot of other things though that pop into the play as well, because with the warmer temperatures come things like ticks, and there's a lot of deer ticks around as well, so you have to be careful about that. There's also poison ivy, so if you're susceptible to poison ivy, you need to be careful with what you grab or what you're walking through. And myself, I'm allergic to bees, and bees seem to like to make nests on the underside of trees a lot, so if you're walking past and you bounce into the tree with the bees in it with the brush mower, they tend to come out and say hi. Or if you're grabbing a vine that's in there, you got to be careful with what you're grabbing for as well. As soon as the warmer weather hits too, that's when a lot of the pests show up. You can see in the upper left photo, or excuse me, the center left photo, I've got an arrow on what's called a European pine sawfly, and the picture right below it, that shows what they can do if they're left untouched. They form these pockets of these like little, I don't know, they're probably 1.5 inch long little worm type bugs, and they just sit there and they will chew a tree down to nothing in no time flat. And we don't like to spray, so what we do is just go through in early May and through the end of the month, and we just squish them on site. And it's not the most pleasant activity, but it's effective and it works pretty well. Come summertime and through the fall, we do a lot of pruning. We have to get the trees in a nicest shape as possible, especially the ones that are up for sale that year. We do all our pruning by hand. These are just some hand shears. These actually were my grandfather's, and they have a little sentimental value, but they also are a very hardy tool and work very well. In the center picture, you can see we also have some small hand pruners, and those are typically towards the top of the tree. We use those. A lot of people use shearing knives, which is kind of like a machete, and some other people use a power machine similar to something you would use as like a hedge trimmer, but it has probably the cutting arm is probably about 3 to 4 times longer. I think the hand shears don't make the tree look like almost too uniform. It allows you to have a little character to the tree, a much more natural look to it. I think they make just a nicer shaped tree from top to bottom. Sometimes you can, if you're not paying attention, you can end up with little inset areas which are not as conical as other areas, but overall they do a really nice job. And we've been using these same technique probably for 10 years now, and it seems to work well for us. And this does, like I said, this does sometimes take towards the end of November, December. And last, here we are. Come out to the field, you get your tree, you take it home and put it up. You put it up in your house, or sometimes you can take it home or take it to your church and put it up there. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and Merry Christmas, and hope to see you at the farm.